To our 10-minute discussion for tonight. This week we are going to be continuing our Snapshot sermon series and talking about this idea that shortcuts can leave us short. Now, if you tuned in last week, you already know this, but for those of you who may have missed last week, this series is going to follow the 4 or 5 sermons that have really made a huge impact on me as I wrote them. And so this is kind of one of those moments where we can discuss the moments that have really shaped our faith, that have happened in personal Bible study or in just hearing the Word of God from other people. Last week, we talked about an exciting topic, and you can check out last week's blog right here on the Facebook page and see exactly what that was. This week, we're talking about the idea of how shortcuts can leave us short. I'd like to start with a little story. Family member of mine was learning how to drive, and while he was learning how to drive, he had someone who was teaching him who was very knowledgeable about driving vehicles, and so this was going to be a good experience. He would really gain a lot from this experience of learning how to drive with the other family member. He goes out, and the family member says, "Do you know what they say about practice and perfection?" And of course the family member chimed back, "Oh, yes, I do. Practice makes perfect." And there's kind of a moment of silence between them. And the other family member who is teaching him how to drive says, "No, perfect practice makes perfect." This story's always stuck with me because there's this idea out there that if we just practice enough at something, or if we just do something often enough, we'll get really good at it. But here's the thing, if we're practicing something the wrong way, no matter how many times we try to do a thing, it's still going to be done the wrong way, right? When you first start a job and you're doing your training and you're going through all of these moments where you really need to know these things and you're learning them firsthand, you need to know the right way the first time. Now, when I started my job at Tim Hortons in Toronto, there was a lot of stuff to take in because I hadn't worked in a fast food industry in a very long time. And not only was this fast food, but this was hospitality. And so those who were the owners of this particular franchise really valued the experience of every guest that was to come in. So instead of just calling them a customer, they were a guest. And they had all of these little practices that made for a very holistic approach to how they would do things. And so every guest that came in was to be treated a certain way, as well as the typical standards you would use for Tim Hortons. And so you had to really learn and glean a lot from not only the training videos, but the hands-on training that you would receive from those who were leading you into your new position. Had I not learned the right way and started practicing over and over and over again the wrong ways, I wouldn't have been very good at what I was doing. In fact, that's the case with just about everything, right? If we are learning things the wrong way, then how can we put them into practice in a way that makes sense in our lives? Well, the same is true of our faith. If we are learning about faith and spiritual things and wonderful things about this world and about God and how we connect with Him, what do we do if the practice that we have doesn't really add up to the kind of God we serve? What if we believe in a God who is loving and just and cares for the orphan and the widow, but the practice of our faith says the opposite? What if the practice of our faith doesn't align with the things that we say about our faith? Is that really telling the truth, or is that a shortcut? If you are on TikTok, you might have seen that I posted a video telling a story about how when I was in school, I landed myself in trouble because I took a shortcut. The shortcut I took in middle school or high school, I can't quite remember which, was letting on that I knew a little bit more about piano than I knew about piano. You see, I'd taken lessons for 10 years. But early on in those lessons, one of my teachers caught that I play by ear, that I don't read sheet music, and that's pretty much the case still. I'm not great at reading sheet music except maybe 1 or 2 notes at a time, and I struggle. But I told my teacher, who had requested that I try out for the band for this one play at the school, that yeah, I can do it. And she asked me to come in and audition, so I took in a piece that I knew inside out. And so I played a piece from Pocahontas that I had heard a billion times growing up, and I nailed it. Note for note, everything was perfect, except I never said that I was reading that music by sight. In fact, I just played it by ear from the thousands of times I had watched that movie on VHS. And so when it came time for the dress rehearsal, I had been practicing really hard. But when you practice really hard and you don't actually have the skills or the ability to begin with, you still don't get very far. You see, I'd taken a shortcut all those 10 years of piano lessons and left myself short. And so when it came time to actually play the music for the school play, I couldn't. And so I get to the dress rehearsal and I'm really trying, but I'm really bad. And so my drama teacher stepped in and she ended up playing. And I ended up playing 1 or 2 notes at a time and playing the bass line because the bass player got sick one of the nights. It was kind of a joke. Like, I left myself so open for such deep embarrassment. And after that, I couldn't really say, hey, I'm a good pianist. I can play the piano by ear. And that's about it. And there's nothing wrong with that, except when you let on you can do more. The shortcut left me really short there. There are plenty of moments in our lives where we do things like that. But we can't let those moments happen in our faith. Because what happens when we find ourselves in a crisis? How many of us were prepared spiritually to deal with the implications of this crazy pandemic that we've gone through? How many of us were in a place where when we were shut away from the church, which has been our lifeline for most of us, how many of us were actually ready to not have weekly worship with one another? That moment where on Sundays we feel so refreshed. Did we have sources in our life to find that same spiritual care that we needed? Were we doing our devotions in a way that really gave us life, or were we depending on the lifeline of someone feeding us? And so, shortcuts leave us short. Real problems need real answers. These real needs in our lives require real answers. And so when we found ourselves locked away from one another and stuck, not having that life-giving Sunday experience, we really had one of 2 choices, didn't we? We could pretend it wasn't happening and just live on the last Sunday that we had in March 2020, for some of us who were lucky to even get into March, or we could dig in and find that wellspring of life that would carry us through. I've got to admit, it took me longer than I needed to admit that maybe I needed to dig a little deeper. Because let's face it, none of us has dug as deeply as we totally need to dig in our faith. Because there will always be the next experience that will be that much harder than anything we've ever faced. And that's not because, the Lord only gives you as much as you can handle. That's a nice phrase. But it's not always our experience, is it? Sometimes it feels like we're drowning. But in reality, God is still right there. Because even when it's too much for us to handle, God is right there, ready to handle it with us. And you know what? He's got it. Real needs require real answers. And we only find those real answers when we do the really hard work of finding those answers. And so when we see ourselves coming up to a crisis, or if a crisis just hits, kind of like in March of last year when it just hit out of nowhere, we need to dig in. We need to enable ourselves to dig in those moments. We can't let ourselves take the shortcuts that leave us short. Because ultimately, you'll end up like the group of us that were traveling, if you've read the blog, coming across some random road through cottage country in the middle of Quebec in the middle of winter, sure that we were going to die because the GPS hadn't updated. And so it took us on another road because the highway hadn't been completed before then. And we found ourselves lost and wondering, how do we move forward? Don't wait until you get to that point. Don't let yourself keep taking shortcuts in your faith. I know, I've done it. I don't want you to do that. I want you to learn from my hard experiences of how we can all do better together. Before we go from our 10-minute discussion, I want to give you a heads up that on Friday I'll be announcing what the book review will be for the following Friday. As we know, this is an every 2 weeks event that we do a big book review of some kind of transformational book that'll help you, your faith, your church, an understanding of theology, something about how to transform your life and faith. And so on Friday, we'll see what the next book is going to be. I've been reading a few over the last week, and I'm really excited about all of them. So I'm trying to pare down exactly which one is next. So look for that on Friday. And as always, keep looking for information on my upcoming book. As of today, the copy editing is finished, and I'm so excited. I just have to do the final notes with them before it's off to typesetting, and then I get to see my cover. I'm so excited, and I'm sure you are too. So I'll let you go because that is our 10-minute discussion for this week, and I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at 6:15.